Thank you very much, Kieran, and you're very welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming along on this lovely sunny day. My first stint in university many years ago saw me studying physics at DCU, and it was my training there in mathematics and in physics that gave me a lifelong love of numbers. When I resumed my studies, this time focusing on history, it stood to reason that I would gravitate towards an aspect of history which was numbers-based. And few aspects of historical research are more numbers-rich than population data, which are readily obtainable from census records. Numbers are, of course, the essence of a census. Think for a moment about the censuses of Ireland. Many of you will have had experiences with the censuses at some point in your past. Some of you will have filled out census forms, thus providing the Central Statistics Office with personal details about you, your name, age, sex, occupation, and so forth. And also details about your abode, when it was built, what heating and sanitation systems it has, your internet connectivity. In Ireland, we get the opportunity to complete a census form more regularly than most. When the statutory or official census series was commenced in Ireland in the early 19th century, censuses were held every 10 years on the years with the concluding digit 1. But in 1951, Ireland moved to a 5-year census cycle, with censuses typically occurring on years with concluding digits 1 and 6. In the north of Ireland, the 10-year census cycle remains in operation. Some of you will, I have no doubt, have undertaken family history research and will have examined the censuses of Ireland of 1901 and 1911, conveniently available online to trace your ancestors. So when we think about the census, we might think that names are what the survey is fundamentally about. But that's not the case. Names are, in fact, incidental to the census. Think about the purpose of census taking in the 19th century. Providing the family historians of 2025 with a means to trace their ancestry was not the reason why the surveys were conducted. The census was, as it is today, a vast social inquiry organised to inform government of details about the national population at a period in time and to facilitate planning. The names recorded by any census are of no consequence to the government and are rarely consequential to any authority. The census authorities do not care that my name is Brian Gurrin. What they are interested in is my sex, my age, my general health, how long my morning commute is, how many solar panels I have on my roof. Asking us for our names on a census form serves an important function, however. It personalises the inquiry for us, thereby encouraging us to buy into the process. I am somebody, and here are the details that you have sought from me. It makes us feel important, that we are more than a number. The Census Office could easily pre-print person A, person B, person C on the census form in the place of the space provided for us to supply our names, and it might have little impact on the results. I say might have little impact rather than would not have any impact for two reasons. First, the personalisation and the buy-in aspect that comes from us providing our names is important. And second, it is easier for us to provide accurate details for a person that we have named and can visualise in our mind rather than for an abstract person. Imagine you are filling out a census form. Wouldn't it be easier to provide accurate details for, say, your son John than to provide the same information for a person abstractly named person C on the form? I've researched the Irish census for more than a quarter of a century at this stage, and I think about census taking in Ireland every single day. Some of you may view the census as simply another run-of-the-mill parliamentary inquiry. The 19th century was the age of inquiry, and Westminster initiated inquiries into all aspects of life in the United Kingdom and across the British Empire. Land ownership, poverty, finance, public health, transport and education are just some of the aspects of Irish and British society that were slid under the parliamentary microscope for scrutiny. In one sense, a census was simply another parliamentary inquiry. an inquiry into population. But the census was, I believe, more than that. Unlike all other inquiries, which operated by sampling a specific section of society, the census uniquely aimed for universality. Either a census obtained details on every single person alive within a particular geographic area, or it did not. If it did, it was deemed to have been a success, but if it fell significantly shy of universality, then it had failed. Statutory censuses were held in Ireland in 1813, and then every decade from 1821 until 1911, inclusive, during Ireland's incorporation within the United Kingdom. After all but the first of these surveys, parliamentary reports were published, abstracting the census findings to various geographic levels and across many social themes. So for 1821, for example, a census report was published which provided the key demographic data to civil parish level. The parliamentary paper was compiled by summarising the data for all the inhabitants counted in each parish. For 1821, we have the same, a published abstract presenting parish level data. For 1841, things are even better. The data from the whopping 1.33 million census forms collected were abstracted to townland level. So for every single census bar the first one, we have census data available to us in abstract form via the official parliamentary papers. Now you may argue that demographic statistics to parish or to townland level are of little use to somebody who's trying to trace their ancestors, and I have some sympathy with that position. But as we have said, the purpose of the census was to facilitate the government in making policy decisions, and for that it needed abstract statistics. Think about what happens to the census information we provide. The data that the government needs finds its way, in abstracted form, into published census reports. But the personal names that we write on the forms are locked away for 100 years before they become available for public inspection. No report is compiled by census officials on the prevalence of particular forenames or surnames recorded on the census forms. Now, as you've heard from Kieran, in 1922, the Public Record Office of Ireland was destroyed in an explosion and fire in the opening days of the Irish Civil War. A catastrophic event indeed, which sadly destroyed millions of Ireland's historical and most valuable records. It was a cataclysmic destruction of our nation's heritage. Let's consider the fate of the manuscript returns of the censuses of Ireland compiled during the period when Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. A total of 11 censuses were held in Ireland between 1813 and 1911. The manuscript returns for the first 5 of these surveys, 1813, 1821, 1831, 1841 and 1851, were sent to the Public Record Office shortly after it opened its doors in 1867 and were retained there until the archive was destroyed. This collection of census surveys was truly magnificent. In it were 35 volumes or bundles of schedules and abstracts from the 1813 census, 479 large volumes of 1821 census returns recording the names of 6.8 million inhabitants, 289 volumes of 1831 census returns containing 1.25 million names, 8.175 million names on the 1.33 million 1841 census forms, 6.55 million names on the 1.2 million 1851 census forms. That's 22.8 million names that were available for examination in the Record Office of Ireland. By the worst of fortune, when these priceless records arrived in the archives, they were moved to the basement of the archive and were retained there for about 17 years before they were moved again to the top floor of the archive. I say by the worst of fortune because when the explosion and fire occurred in the record treasury, the iron shelving and structures melted, cascading the records from the 6 floors into the flames. Most of the inferno was overground, however. Many of the records that were in the vaults survived the inferno. But now consider this. A few decades earlier, the 1861 and 1871 census forms were deliberately destroyed by government instruction after the two surveys were completed and the census reports prepared and published. Furthermore, a few years before the Record Office was destroyed, the census forms from the 1881 and 1891 surveys were pulped because of the paper shortage during World War I, taking about 10 million names to a watery end. These decisions may seem extraordinary to our 21st century minds. Why would a government deliberately destroy a nation's cultural heritage in this fashion? I think the answer is obvious. It was because, as we have noted, the personal names and details recorded during a census were viewed as incidental and of no importance. It was the abstracted statistical information in the published reports that were the important outputs from a census. Abstract information to townland or civil parish or barony or poor law union was the goal of the census officials. And once that information was available, the inputs to it, the individual census forms, were surplus to requirements. Better to destroy useless records and have paper than to retain records and have nothing to write on. Now, as we know, the 1901 and 1911 census forms escaped destruction, and these are available online. The 1926 census remains closed in Ireland until next year, when it will be open to the public. A release which genealogists anticipate with relish. Regrettably, the returns from the 1926 census of Northern Ireland were pulped during World War II. Now, I'm going to briefly take you through the history of census taking in Ireland, with a specific focus on the prominent role that Dublin Castle played in Ireland's census story. We will start our story more than a quarter of a millennium ago, in 1766. The religious census of Ireland of 1766 is one of the richest sources available to the historical and genealogical researcher for the period prior to the 19th century. Although most of the original returns were destroyed in the destruction of the Public Record Office in 1922, 59 original items from the census survived the fire, along with transcripts, extracts, and parish numerical abstracts from many parts of the island. So what was this census about? Well, during the 18th century, Parliament intermittently initiated inquiries to investigate the strength of the Catholic Church in Ireland, then heavily laboured by penal statutes designed to damage and weaken it. In 1731, for example, an inquiry into the state of popery was held, which required county sheriffs and parish clergymen to provide information about Catholic church structures and Catholic educational facilities. The information to be returned to Enoch Stern, the Clerk of the House of Lords. The following year, a national religious census was held, with the hearth tax collectors instructed to determine confessional allegiances when collecting the tax that year. The hearth tax was a 2 shilling tax that was payable if you had a fireplace or a hearth. In 1764 and 1765, the hearth tax collectors were again pressed into service in that fashion. On this occasion, the attempted census failed. So in 1766, Parliament revisited the issue, ordering a national census. The 1766 religious census originated in a resolution of the House of Lords, which I show you here. It was issued on the 5th of March, 1766. And it called for the Church of Ireland parish clergy to return to the House of Lords, or to send to the House of Lords, a list of the several families, or the names of the householders in their parishes, with the religion noted for each householder. And the ministers were also to provide a list of the names of Catholic clergymen residing in their parishes. And all of this information was to be returned to the House of Lords by the first Monday after the parliamentary recess, which was the 5th of May. Now, this was a very tight time frame given the social circumstances in Ireland at the time. In the short space of 62 days, the requirement of the Lords had to be communicated to the diocesan offices, whose clerks had to prepare individual letters of instruction for each parish. These letters had to be posted to the individual ministers, who had to conduct their censuses and post the information back to Henry Baker Stern, the clerk of the House of Lords. Henry Baker Stern was the son of Enoch Stern, who had been serving as clerk of the House of Lords in 1731 when the State of Popery inquiry was undertaken. Once the returns from the 1766 census were received at Parliament House, they were collated into bundles of papers and a manuscript book was produced summarising the religious totals by parish. The returns were retained within the House of Lords building until 1802, when they were transferred to what was described as a very insecure house, 35 Anglesey Street, by cartload, without order or method and free from any check whatsoever. This building, supported by props and uprights, was in danger of imminent collapse. And the first report of the Irish Record Commission warned that it was in a state so incommodious and insecure as to require immediate attention. And if my geography is correct, I believe number 35 to have been located here at the back of Subway sandwiches on Dame Street. Now, in 1812, the transfer of the parliamentary records, which included the 1766 census returns, the transfer of the parliamentary records to the Record House in Dublin, the Record Tower in Dublin Castle was decided upon, and in 1813, William Shaw Mason, Secretary to the Irish Record Commission, reported that fireproofing measures had been put in place in the tower and it was ready to receive documents. Now let's remember that name, William Shaw Mason, because he becomes quite important later on. By March 1815, the transfer had been effected and the parliamentary records were then accessible in the secure surrounds of the Parliamentary Record Office in the Record Tower, Dublin Castle, where they remained for more than half a century. Now, 3 decades later, in 1798, a remarkable census of Dublin City was organised, coinciding with the outbreak of the 1798 rebellion. Coinciding with the outbreak of the 1798 rebellion, this census of the capital was planned, organised and funded by the Reverend James Whitelaw, Vicar of St. Catherine's Parish in Dublin, though with the backing and approval of government. Conscious of the importance of his work, Whitelaw, the historian of Dublin's wretchedness, noted his ambition of being the first to offer to the public what it has often wished for in vain, an accurate, well-arranged census of a considerable capital. In his own words, I availed myself of the favourable opportunity offered by the unhappy situation of this city at the commencement of the late rebellion, and with the sanction of government, but at my own private expense and toil, began a census of Dublin early in the month of May 1798. On the day the rebellion broke out, a proclamation was issued by the Lord Mayor instructing the city's residents to support Whitelaw's efforts. I, Thomas Fleming, Lord Mayor, do hereby desire that all housekeepers do place upon the outside of their doors a list of all persons in their respective houses, distinguishing such as are strangers from those who actually make part of the family. But if there may happen to be persons who from pecuniary embarrassments are obliged to conceal themselves, I do not require such names to be placed on the outside of the door, provided their names are sent to me. An undertaking of extraordinary magnitude, Whitelaw's survey counted more than 170,000 people in the city over a 5-month period. 2 methods were employed: self-enumeration, as specified in Fleming's proclamation, with householders pinning details to their front doors, and a household canvass involving enumerators interviewing householders and recording their details. As its bulk amounted to nearly 500 tables in folio, rendered its publication inexpedient, Whitelaw contented himself with publishing a volume entitled An Essay on the Population of Dublin in 1805, which presented 1798 population data for the city to street and parish level. Whitelaw was justifiably proud of his monumental achievement. Think for a moment about the scale of the task in hand, counting every single person in a city the size of Dublin. His census described a city of contrasts, with great wealth and appalling poverty living side by side. Some of his descriptions of the poverty and deprivation make for the grimmest of reading. Listen to this description of part of Dublin's ancient heart. In the ancient parts of Dublin, the streets are, with a few exceptions, generally narrow, the houses crowded together, and the rears or backyards of very limited extent. This crowded population, wherever it obtains, is almost universally accompanied by a very serious evil, a degree of filth and stench inconceivable except by such as have visited those scenes of wretchedness. Into the backyard of each house, frequently not 10 feet drop, is flung from the windows of each apartment the ordure and utter filth of its numerous inhabitants, from whence it is so seldom removed that I have seen it nearly on a level with the windows of the first floor, and the moisture that after heavy rains oozes from this heap, having frequently no sewer to carry it off, runs into the street by the entry leading to the staircase. His experiences while enumerating in St. Joseph's Lane, a street no longer in existence, but in 1798, located about 150 metres from where we are now, cannot fail to shock. When I attempted in the summer of 1798 to take the population of a ruinous house in St. Joseph's Lane near Castle Market, I was interrupted in my progress by an inundation of putrid blood, alive with maggots, which had from an adjoining slaughterhouse burst the back door and filled the hall to the depths of several inches. By the help of a plank and some stepping stones, which I procured for that purpose, for the inhabitants, without any concern, waded through it, I reached the staircase. It had rained violently, and from the shattered state of the roof, a torrent of water made its way through every floor, from the garret to the ground. The sallow looks and filth of the wretches who crowded around me indicated their situation, though they seemed insensible to the stench which I could scarcely sustain for a few minutes. In the garret I found the entire family of a poor working shoemaker, 7 in number, lying in fever without a human being to administer to their wants. On observing that his apartment had not a door, he informed me that his landlord, finding him not able to pay the week's rent in consequence of his sickness, had the preceding Saturday taken it away in order to force him to abandon the apartment. I counted in this sty 37 persons. One of the deputy keepers of the Public Record Office described the manuscript census as follows. It is bound in 2 large folio volumes. Each street is given in detail, the occupier or proprietor of each house, with the number of male and female inhabitants of the upper classes, servants and lower classes respectively. The houses are given in their order, and as all intersecting streets and lanes are carefully indicated, the houses can, in most cases, be identified with certainty. Much of the history of Whitelaw's two-volume census is unknown. Whitelaw lived until February 1813, and he may have retained the manuscript in his possession until his death. Then the trail goes cold for the best part of 80 years until the manuscript resurfaces about 1896, where, in the Record Tower in Dublin Castle, bundled in with a collection of William Shaw Mason's papers. Mason had an extraordinary interest in all matters pertaining to Irish population levels, and census taking, and perhaps he obtained possession of Whitelaw's manuscript census after he died. We've mentioned William Shaw Mason on a few occasions already, so who was he? An important figure within the establishment in early 19th century, Mason was appointed secretary of the newly established Record Commission of Ireland in 1810. The Record Commission was based here in Dublin Castle, with Mason's office located in an annex to the Record Tower about 50 metres away from where we are right now, on the first floor of the entrance. In the 1810s, he organised a parochial survey in Ireland with the intention of publishing a statistical account of every parish in Ireland along the lines of John Sinclair's fine statistical account of Scotland. Mason's attempt proved less successful than Sinclair's Scottish exercise, but 3 volumes of parochial surveys appeared in print between 1814 and 1819, providing detailed accounts of about 90 parishes throughout Ireland. His parochial survey work may have brought him to the attention of the Lord Lieutenant as a suitable person to manage the first official census of Ireland, which commenced in 1813. And he was appointed as director of the census. Since his office was in the Record Tower, the castle became the organisational hub for Ireland's first official census, with the enumeration details from the counties transmitted to Mason's office as they were completed. Counting a nation at any time is a vast undertaking, but counting the population of Ireland in 1813 presented various complicated challenges. When we think about census taking today, we think of them recording the names and details of people. But in 1813, the enumerators were not required to return the names of people, but merely to provide numerical figures to parish or townland level. Here's an example of a complete return for part of East County Galway. As you can see, no names of people are given, simply numerical details for houses, families, occupations and populations by townland. Although it was envisaged that the enumeration would take about 4 months to complete, the count, commencing on the 1st of May, dragged on through 1813 and through 1814 to be terminated in early 1815 with only about 80% of the island enumerated. The first Irish census, with Mason at the helm, had ended in abject failure. The 1813 population returns received at the castle remained in Record Tower for the succeeding 5 decades. Now, this outcome proved an embarrassment to the establishment in Ireland, anxious to highlight their administrative capabilities to their British counterparts. Britain had successfully completed censuses in 1801 and 1811. After the failure of the Irish survey, the finger-pointing commenced. Mason's credibility was on the line, so he waded into the fight. The failure did not lay at the doorstep of the Record Tower, he protested. The real culprits were the grand jury members, some of who failed to appoint enumerators, and others who had failed to keep an eye on the enumeration as it progressed. The enumerators, the barony high constables, many of whom, according to Mason, were simply not up to the task. And the people, many of whom were suspicious of the motives of a government they viewed as alien and operating against their best interests. Despite this humbling failure, it was still necessary, however, that Ireland be enumerated. So an act was promptly introduced to hold a second census. Although this act passed in 1815, the enumeration was held over until 1821 to coincide with the third census of Britain. One thing must have seemed certain: Mason's involvement with Irish census taking could hardly be maintained. But Mason was nothing if not dogged, and his steely finger pointing after the 1813 debacle proved successful. He retained the superintendentship for the second Irish census. New procedures were introduced in advance of Ireland's second census. The grand jury were squeezed out to be replaced by the regularly meeting bench of magistrates. Competency tests were introduced for enumerators. Catholic priests were requested to impress on their flocks the importance of providing accurate information. In 1819, Mason conducted a trial run holding evaluation and enumeration of the barony of Portlahinch in Queen's County, now County Laois. The returns from this survey were filed with Mason's papers in Dublin Castle. It might be assumed that given the earlier failure, a conservative approach would be taken in 1821 in order to nudge a complete enumeration of Ireland over the line. As we saw, the first Irish census required enumerators to return basic numerical information only. This mirrored the approach taken in Britain in 1801 and 1811, and again in Britain in 1821 and 1813, when only numerical data were sought. In Ireland, however, a radical new approach was taken which turned census taking on its head. Ireland would not conduct a numeric enumeration in 1821, but a nominal one. Its army of enumerators were tasked with calling to every dwelling in the country, putting a set of questions to the occupier, which included requesting and noting the names of every person living in the house. This was a risky strategy. Ireland could ill afford a second failure along the lines of the 1813 result. Furthermore, it risked provoking opposition from a suspicious public. There is quite the difference between asking somebody how many people were living in the house and asking for the names and personal details of every person living there. This was not the first time a complete nominal enumeration of a country had been attempted. Some Scandinavian countries had been to the fore in organising similar surveys, with Iceland holding the first complete nominal enumeration in 1703. But full nominal national enumerations were still alien in the English-speaking world. Where the Irish enumeration differed, however, was in terms of scale. Iceland's 1703 census recorded nominal details for about 50,000 odd people. Denmark and Norway upped the bid in 1801 with a nominal enumeration totaling 1.8 million people. But Ireland scooped the pot in 1821 by recording the names and personal details for a whopping 6,801,827 citizens of the island. To put these figures in context, if the 1703 census of Iceland was the height of a standard two-storey house, the 1821 census of Ireland would be 1.3 times the height of the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. If I was giving this talk 3 years ago, I would have argued that the Irish census of 1821 was a groundbreaking undertaking within the United Kingdom. But that would have reflected a lack of understanding on my part. Research over the last 3 years has clarified the picture. I can now say that the census of Ireland of 1821 was not simply a small step in the growth of statistical enumeration within the United Kingdom, but that it represented a giant leap in the development of census taking worldwide. I am not aware of any census conducted anywhere at any time before 1821 that recorded more personal names than the Irish behemoth. And this vast exercise was organised and administered from the record tower across the courtyard in Dublin Castle. The enumeration returns were received at Mason's office in the tower. There they were digested and bound into 879 massive volumes of 500 pages or 500 or so pages, the entire collection holding the names and details of 6.8 million people counted under Mason's watchful eye. This magnificent collection of census volumes remained in the tower for the next half century. The next census of Ireland was held in 1831. In spite of Mason's triumph in 1821, by this time he had fallen out of favour and the post of superintendent of the census passed to George Hatchell. Hatchell based himself at the Custom House on the Quays, and the returns for that census were stored there. 10 years later, the 1841 census, which enumerated almost 8.2 million people throughout the island, the highest population ever reported for the island of Ireland, was also conducted from the Custom House. In 1845, a registry office was established to register non-Catholic marriages, with William Donnelly appointed as Ireland's first registrar. The registry office was located at 9 Henrietta Street on the north side of the Dublin city near King's Inns. For the 1851 census, Donnelly was appointed as Census Commissioner, and the Census Office was opened for Donnelly's convenience 4 doors down the street from the registry office at 5 Henrietta Street, now the home of the People Before Profit political party. Directly across the road from number 5 is 14 Henrietta Street, Dublin's Museum of Social Life, which has been ably described in my colleague Tim Murtaugh's wonderful volume, Spectral Mansions, The Making of a Dublin Tenement, 1800-1914. When the 1851 census was completed, its records were also transferred to the Custom House. So in 1867, Ireland's principal census records were located as follows. The 1766 records were in the Record Tower, Dublin Castle, moved there in 1815. The 1813 and 1821 census records were also in the Record Tower, where those two censuses were organised from. The 1831, 41 and 51 census records were in the Custom House. The 1798 records from William Whitelaw's Census of Dublin were probably in the Record House because they were discovered in a press in the building in the 1890s. So what happened to these census records? In 1867, the Public Record Office of Ireland passed, establishing a new archive for Ireland's public records to be located in the Four Courts complex. The Act specified the historical records which were to be transferred to the new archive as a matter of priority. These included all the records, maps, books and documents of whatever nature or kind now deposited in the Custom House building, Dublin. As we've seen, the census returns and records for 1831, 1841 and 1851 were there, so they were covered by this point in the Act. Also to be transferred were all the parliamentary records and all other records now deposited in the Record Tower, Dublin Castle. Well, the parliamentary records included the returns from the 1766 religious census, so their transfer to the Public Record Office was to be effected by this point. And since all other records in Record Tower, that term covered the census records, the 1813 and 1821 census records, they were also to be transferred. Note that there was no time limit on this section of the Act. So 3 decades later, when James Whitelaw's Census of Dublin turned up in the Record Tower in Dublin Castle, it was covered by the All Other Records phrase, and its transfer to the Public Record Office was required. So the story of the destruction of Ireland's census records is a tragic one. Ireland's archivists of the 19th and early 20th centuries were diligent, highly committed individuals. But it was this diligence which paradoxically ensured that the destruction of Ireland's census records was near complete. Over the course of 55 years, PRO staff secured the transfer of almost all of Ireland's early census records to the archive for protection. Ironically, if they had been less committed, more census material might have survived. But let us conclude on a positive note. Not everything was lost. Some original manuscript returns and fragments did survive, including 4 large volumes from the 1821 census, Ireland's Great Census. Also, thousands of transcripts were taken from the original census records by genealogists and records agents during the census's residence in the PRO. Many of these transcripts have also survived. Over the course of the last 5 years, the Virtual Treasury has been busily seeking out surviving census records in archives in Ireland and Britain and beyond to make these rare survivors freely available to researchers. The results of our searches are freely available online in the VRTI. Please feel free to investigate our virtual VRTI website, our Virtual Treasury website, because you never know who might turn up and who you might find there. So thank you very much, everybody, for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions if anybody has any questions. Thank you.